Greetings, everybody. Welcome to your video series on an introduction to sociology. The topic for this video is social movement theories. We're going to talk about three theories in this video: framing, value-added theory, and the emergent norm theory. So let's get started. What do we mean by framing? Framing is really how a person or group goes about arguing the case for their social movement. For example, there are three different kinds of frames that people undertake in order to argue the case of their social movement. The first frame is diagnostic framing. This is when a person or group simply states the problem that the social movement is trying to address in a clear, convincing way. The prognostic frame is the solution to the social problem that the social movement is trying to address and how that solution can be achieved. The third frame is the motivational frame, and this is when the person or groups of people are calling others to action. Join our social movement. Here's how you can get involved. Here's the changes that we're hoping to make. Now, let's look at an example of how framing works. We talked about the environmental movement in an earlier video, so we can apply the environmental movement to the idea of framing. When we talk about the first frame, the diagnostic frame, here's where we're stating the problem in a clear way. Well, human activity is causing the climate to change, right? And as a result of that change, we are experiencing some pretty dire consequences in terms of, intense weather systems, more vicious hurricanes, for example, more long-lasting droughts, more wildfires out in the western part of the United States. There are things that are happening in our weather patterns that we have not seen before, and we can attribute this to the human activity. Almost 9 billion people on the planet. Our activities, our use of fossil fuels, for example, our dietary habits, all of these things are causing the planet's climate to change. That's the diagnostic frame. That's the problem. The prognostic frame is the solution to that problem. Well, we need to develop cleaner energy sources. We need to develop less dependency on fossil fuels. We need to think about our diets and how our food is impacting the planet. And then the motivational frame would be the call to action. Hey, this is involving everybody, right? This isn't everybody's sharing the same climate. And what happens to our climate is going to affect person X in the same way that it's going to impact person Y. So we all need to be interested in this, and we all need to do our part to help mitigate the consequences of climate change. So that's how framing works. Our next theory that we're going to look at is the value-added theory. The value-added theory was developed by a guy named Neil Smelser. And he was really just trying to understand how it is social movements come to be. What are the steps, or what is the process that causes a social movement to take off and be successful? He has about 6 steps to his theory. The first step he identifies as structural conduciveness. This is when people become aware that there is a problem in society, right? This is kind of like that diagnostic frame that we just talked about. What is the problem? If we think about the environment, obviously the problem is climate change and what's happening as a result of human activity on the planet. The next step is structural strain. Smelser says there has to be some kind of tension in our society where people feel that their needs are not being met or their concerns are not being addressed. It's that strain that is likely to be the spark that leads to a social movement. He then says the third piece here is the generalized belief, where people become accepting of an idea or a belief that, yes, this is the problem and this is the cause. So if we think about the environmental movement, the generalized belief is that human activity, our use of fossil fuels in particular, our dietary requirements in terms of meat production are causing our climate to alter. It's causing our climate to change. That is the problem and cause that's been identified and accepted by most people. He goes on to say that the fourth part here of his theory is the precipitating factor. There is a dramatic event that takes place that highlights the issues around the social problem and why the social movement exists in the first place. Well, we have lots of dramatic events taking place over the last several years that highlight the consequences of climate change. If we go all the way back to the 1970s, for example, when the environmental movement first took off, the precipitating factor was our rivers were catching on fire because there were so many chemicals and toxic crud being dumped into our rivers. And when people could see the rivers on fire, that was the dramatic event that said, hey, we need to do something about our air and water and try to clean this up. And today, if we think about climate change, we can see here in the United States, almost every summer, we're now seeing these hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, all the way back to Katrina, that are bigger in size. They are higher in their intensity, and their destructiveness is becoming greater and greater, resulting not only in higher costs, but a higher loss of life. And then stage 5 here for Smeltzer is the mobilization for action. People actually coming together, leaders emerging to direct action against the social problem. Organizations are forming, offices are being formed around the country, money is being solicited so that the issues around the social problem can actually be addressed. Excuse me, whether that's through legislation or people just changing their own behaviors. Now, Smeltzer also identifies a 6th stage here that he calls social control. He says when it comes to any social movement, there will generally be some kind of backlash. There are other groups of people who disagree with the call to action, or they disagree with the generalized belief, and they try to stop what the social movement is trying to achieve. So in the case of the environment, we know that there are many people and many groups of people who do not support the science behind climate change and believe that we should continue to use fossil fuels, for example, as a way to provide energy, and that the use of these fossil fuels aren't really impacting our environment as much as the environmentalists would like people to believe. This social control group would argue that our climate goes through periodic changes over time and that this is nothing different. So again, whenever you have a social movement, Smeltzer believes there are always going to be groups of people who are fighting against the changes that social movement is wanting to achieve. We can look at the LGBTQ movement as another example of how Smeltzer's theory works. The structural conduciveness, the awareness of a problem. This was back in the 70s again, when LGBTQ people were facing discrimination and oppression. It was legal to fire people for being gay. It was illegal to be gay or to engage in same-sex relationships at one point. The tensions that were, the structural strain that was caused here was the idea that, people should be treated equally. We're all equal under the law. We the people, everybody has the right to pursue happiness in their own way. And the generalized belief here would be that homosexuality, gay relationships were not, should not be treated any differently, that there was nothing inherently wrong or, bad about being gay. And then the precipitating factor here would be the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City, when the gay patrons of a bar, the Stonewall Inn, actually fought back for the first time against the police who were raiding that bar. And then mobilization for action. We had lots of LGBT groups and organizations form, and lots of leaders who took the lead to press for equality and civil rights. That eventually led to the Supreme Court legalizing same-sex marriage in 2015. And then, of course, social control. Lots of groups who are still opposed to equality for the LGBTQ community and who do not support the right to a same-sex marriage. We can look at the Black Lives Matter, again, as an example, more modern-day example. We can follow Smelser's theory right through structural conduciveness, the problem of police brutality against the Black community, all the way through the precipitating factor. Lots of precipitating factors here, but certainly the murder of George Floyd several years ago, which was the catalyst for the Black Lives Matter movement, was the precipitating factor. And then if we think about the social control here, the attempts to push back on the Black Lives Matter with the All Lives Matter, rebuttal, that there's nothing particularly special about Black people, that all people's lives matter, was really an attempt to shout down and discount what the Black Lives Matter movement was trying to say, and that was that there are police departments throughout the country that do target and treat Black constituents differently, that leads to more violence and the death of Black people. So that is Smelser's value-added theory. The last theory here is the Emergent Norm Theory. This was developed by Ralph Turner and Louis Killian, and they are trying to understand what happens to crowd behavior when certain events take over. So their Emergent Norm Theory basically says that once crowds develop, this could be any of those four types we talked about, a new set of norms may emerge, thus taking individuals out of their preconceived notions of normalcy, and people will begin to behave then in very different and unexpected ways. So again, when you are in the midst of a crowd, and all of us have experienced crowd behavior at some point, whether it's in a concert or a protest or a demonstration, we know what that energy is like and how it shifts our own individual behavior into something else entirely. And I think we can use, again, January 6th as an example where this idea of a new set of norms emerging that are taking individuals out of their preconceived notions of normalcy, and then people began to behave on that day in very different and unexpected ways. Again, for example, what started out as a peaceful gathering to hear the former president speak, then turned into this raucous sort of mob-like mentality where hundreds and eventually thousands of people stormed the Capitol. That may not have been their original goal that day, but because of the collective behavior of that crowd, this sort of emergent norm theory took hold where their individual behaviors became something else very differently, and they began to act in a very crowd-like mentality as opposed to an individual mentality. So that's the Emergent Norm Theory, and that's going to do it for our three theories. So that's it for now. Thanks for checking in. Never stop learning, and remember, sociology is everywhere.